The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello. Thank you for joining me today for a brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird. It's wonderful to have you here. Now, if you're a long-time listener, you'll know that the only thing I find more intriguing than an unsolved mystery is an unsolved mystery that has a current glimmer of hope attached to it. And the strange but true tale I have to share with you today fits squarely into that second category. I'm going to be telling you the story of the John Doe known as the Gentleman of Heligoland, although you may have also heard it referred to as the Tale of the North Sea Man. And this is a case that was requested by our lovely listener Heidi quite some time ago now. And in hindsight, I'm very glad I waited to cover it until now, because over the past 3 years or so, this 30-year-old cold case has actually popped back up in the news for several fascinating reasons. So enough intro chatter, let's get right on into the story. On the 11th of July 1994, a border guard boat positioned around 20 kilometres west of the German island of Heligoland made a gruesome discovery. The guards had spotted the body of a man who appeared to have been around 6 foot 5 inches tall, dressed in distinctive, smart clothing, and they proceeded to pull him from the cold waters of the North Sea that they were stationed in. Immediately, they noticed several incredibly suspicious things about the deceased man. Not only were there signs of trauma, most likely blunt force violence, around his head and upper body, but he also appeared to have been weighed down by 2 cast iron shoe lasts, also known as cobbler's shoes, which weighed around 3 kilograms each. Picture a shoe-shaped solid object, like a mannequin for a real shoe, if you will, something that would fit perfectly inside a shoe. That's what they looked like, and they had been strategically attached to his body with the clear purpose of weighing it down. So of course, given the bizarre circumstances under which he had been found and the evidence pointing to apparent foul play, after the border guard boat reached the shore, the authorities quickly ordered that an autopsy should take place to try and understand more about the man and attempt to determine what fate had befallen him. Just for some context, the island, or technically small islands, of Heligoland are located around 46 kilometres away from mainland Germany. If you were to look at a map of the country, it's off to the northwest and sits in the middle of the ocean between Germany and Denmark. It's only around a total of 4.2 kilometres or 1.6 miles squared in size, so it's a tiny place. Therefore, it was decided that the man's body should be transported to the mainland for his autopsy, and it was officials in the city of Wilhelmshaven in Lower Saxony who agreed to undertake the task. And although it's not entirely clear exactly when this happened, the unnamed man soon gained a nickname that I'll be using to refer to him throughout this episode, which was the Gentleman. Now, naturally, the main purpose of the autopsy was to try and work out how the gentleman died, but the overall investigation had a second, equally important goal: to try and work out who he was, and the clues presented during this extensive examination were very intriguing indeed. Let's begin by looking at the physical evidence in terms of his actual body. The autopsy confirmed that the gentleman had been very tall, somewhere around 6 foot 5 as I mentioned, and it was estimated that he had been between 45 and 50 years old at the time he died. He was white and had likely weighed between 11 and 12 stone. That's around 70 to 76 kilograms, which would have meant that his build was slim for his height. Apologies, as this is a very unpleasant detail, but due to the condition of his body when they pulled it from the water, the experts found it more difficult to say what his eye eye colour would have been. The same goes for his hair colour and hair length too. The autopsy confirmed that the injuries to his head and ribs were likely caused by hefty blows to these areas, and that he had been deliberately weighed down with the cobbler's shoes, probably by those who had injured or killed him. And whilst all of this information was useful, especially when it came to forming a police sketch of the gentleman, which I will put up on our social media pages for you to see, this was only half the story, because what was arguably even more interesting to the authorities and to the media was the physical evidence in terms of the gentleman's clothing, as well as the cobbler's shoes, and you'll soon see why. Let's take those heavy cobbler's shoes first actually, because something the investigators quickly noticed about the 3-kilogram cast iron weights was that they had a noticeable inscription on them, which simply read AJK. It didn't take them long to discover that AJK was the trademark of a company called AJ Jackson. And if you're thinking that that name doesn't sound particularly German or even Danish for that matter, that's because it's not. AJ Jackson was actually based here in the UK, in Bristol to be exact. From here, things only got stranger. I noted earlier that the gentleman's clothing was distinctive, and one of the most notable items he was wearing was his necktie. The tie was made of wool and featured a very specific striped design. Some sources describe it as blue, green and yellow, or even grey, brown and orange, but to me it looks more like dark blue, light blue, green and yellow, but the varying widths of the stripes were probably the most unique thing about it. Although they initially mistakenly believed that the tie might have signified that the gentleman belonged to a certain private members club, the police were ultimately able to determine that it had been mass manufactured by none other than the hugely popular Marks and Spencer. And although this information was only released to the public relatively recently in 2022, it was a significant clue in the investigation. Now, fascinatingly, the investigators were able to narrow the specific tie design down to one that had been produced and sold to 2 different M&S customer bases, the English-speaking market and the French-speaking market, as the label featured words in both languages. But this didn't mean that those were the only 2 countries it was sold in. At the time of the gentleman's death, the French-speaking market for Marks and Spencer went as far as Canada. So in a way, rather than narrowing down the search, it actually opened up whole new possibilities about their John Doe's origin. And the rest of his clothing followed this same pattern. Whilst his trousers were found to have been made in France, his shoes were very much English. The leather loafers, which would have originally been black or navy, were by Church & Co Limited, a prestigious and expensive shoemakers based in Northamptonshire. And to add to their British origin, the gentleman's specific pair of these loafers had been both resold and reheeled at some point, with the latter bearing the mark of the Dinky Heel Company, which was also based in Bristol. So let's recap. We have the body of an unidentified man found off the coast of Germany, wearing some clothing that was very specific to France, possibly Canada, and definitely England. We know that he suffered his injuries while still alive, and that there were some very distinctive aspects of his appearance. Yet, at every turn during the initial investigation, the trail went cold. Now, there are a couple of important points to look deeper into at this stage. The first being the gentleman moniker that the man was given. In the decades since his death, it seems that this title has become a source of frustration to some of those still looking into the case, because it does suggest that because the man was dressed in clothing that wasn't necessarily cheap and looked quite smart, that this automatically meant he had been rich or of a certain socio-economic background. But the German police have been adamant in more recent years that this can't be taken as fact, explaining in a quote that it cannot be necessarily assumed that the dead person was wealthy, emphasizing that the Marks and Spencer tie was ultimately a mass market product. bought, and noting that although his shoes would have originally carried a larger price tag, they had been repaired multiple times and could well have been purchased second-hand. This sentiment has been echoed by Roland Hughes from the British Missing Persons charity Locate International, who said, "There's been a bit of a misconception that he was some high society guy, but that's potentially misleading. He was well dressed, but nothing out of the ordinary." The German authorities actually cited this aim of setting the record straight about the gentleman's nickname as a key reason why they went public with more information about the case in 2022. So it really is a vital point to make when we're discussing this story. I did debate whether I should be using the name in the title of this episode, but I decided that because I was going to explore and explain this development that it would be okay. After all, as we know, when unknown figures within true crime cases are given a catchy nickname, it can very much help to draw people's attention and keep the case in the public eye. All of that said, I'm going to change gears somewhat now, because it's the second point I wanted to explore in more detail that brings us even further up to date with this story, and that is the question of where the man could have originated from, not just in the sense of where he had disappeared from, but also which country he could have called home. This is genuinely fascinating and really does give me some hope that uncovering answers in this case is still possible. Now, at the time the gentleman was found, investigators spoke about how they believed he could have been in the water for some time and could well have travelled quite a distance in the sea. I'm going to come back to the point about the length of time between his death and his discovery shortly, but first I'm going to focus on the matter of distance. Carsten Bettels from the Lower Saxony Police Academy has spoken directly about this, expressing the belief that it's possible his body could have travelled from as far away as Great Britain. And this is obviously an important part of the puzzle. Finding out where his body entered the water from would definitely be a huge break in the case. But whilst this part remains a mystery for now, there was actually an amazing development in this story that emerged in late 2022, following an exhumation of the gentleman's body that took place in 2021. The exhumation was done in order to create a full DNA profile from his remains, so that researchers and investigators can make the most of advancements that have happened in this field since he was originally buried back in 1994. Experts from a handful of universities and other institutions around the world were brought into the fold to try and help in the case, including those from Goldsmiths University of London and the University of Staffordshire here in the UK. But it was actually a school from much further afield that has so far returned the most compelling results. In August of 2022, it was reported that a cold case review team from the Murdoch University, all the way over in Perth, Australia, had made an incredible discovery. Criminology and forensic science students conducted isotope ratio analysis on a sample provided of the gentleman's bones, and they concluded that it was, quote, very likely that he had actually spent most of his life in Australia. Now, if you've not heard about this kind of testing before, it's truly amazing. An article published in the Independent newspaper explained it so perfectly and concisely when they said, quote, the isotopic compositions of food, water and dust differ across the globe due to variations in climate, bedrock, salt and human activity, and so do the isotopic compositions of the tissues of humans who ingest them. What this means in simple terms is that the test can show what a person ate and drank and the kind of air they breathed whilst they were alive, and this reflects the places that a person likely lived. I think this is just extraordinary. The findings about his time likely spent in Australia were revealed during the final day of the country's National Missing Persons Week, which is a time where members of the public are encouraged to provide DNA samples, in the hopes of potential familial matches popping up against the missing persons database. So far, there sadly hasn't been a match for the gentleman as far as we know, but knowing that there is new movement in this cold case is definitely noteworthy. But this development didn't just have an impact in Australia. Like I said, the aim was to create that full DNA profile, and the team from Murdoch University were the ones who were able to do this. Brendan Chapman and Dr. David Keatley, who are directors of the Cold Case Review Group, then connected back up with the police over in Germany to try and assist them in the case. And really, the latest information is that this DNA profile is now being checked and referenced against both national and international databases. Brendan Chapman gave a quote about the Australian team's findings, including the isotope analysis, saying, "It's almost unbelievable. What are the chances that from this small collection of universities working on this case, that one would be from the country where the man originated?" And I agree with him. It was when I read about this update that I just knew I had to feature this story on the podcast today. Truly, what are the chances? It really is kind of amazing. Now, of course, this both opens up a huge number of new questions and provides some kind of focus point for investigators. It's a strange situation in that respect. I'm going to dive into some of the theories around this case in a few moments, because I definitely have some thoughts, but I just wanted to dwell on the DNA side of things for a minute longer. Now, this is something I've spent a lot of time looking into in general, stemming from my continuing fascination with the Angel of the Meadow murder case that I featured back in episode 11 of the podcast. It seems that, in theory, if you have a DNA profile for an unnamed victim, then it should be straightforward to run this through different databases and see if you find a match, right? Well, unfortunately, it isn't always quite that simple. Firstly, different countries have wildly different rules when it comes to data privacy and the way that this DNA match testing can be performed. And secondly, whilst a lot of DNA profiles of lots of different people exist on the planet, only a certain percentage will be held by the police force or the government of a country. The rest might be with genetic genealogy companies, provided by people who have wanted to look into their family tree, for example. And often, researchers, investigators, or other authorities don't have the right to access this DNA information held by private companies. You would also likely be looking for a familial match too, a descendant of the Gentleman or the Angel of the Meadow, which adds another level of complexity. Trust me, I could go on and on about this. It's a very deep and layered topic, but my overall point is that whilst this definitely does give me hope, I'm trying to be cautiously optimistic about what this could mean. Before we get to the theories, I wanted to loop back to something I mentioned earlier, which was the question around when the gentleman might have actually died versus when his body was found. So, strangely, I noticed that some articles I was reading about the case stated that it's possible that he had been killed up to 7 months before he was discovered, but I personally find it tricky to believe that his body could have been in the water for that long and remained relatively intact, especially with things like natural decay and animal activity taken into account. So I looked into this further and found a statement from Fiona Gabbett, Professor of Psychology and Director of the Forensic Psychology Unit at Goldsmiths, and she was one of the experts brought in recent years to take a look at the case. She said, quote, "We believe that the man is likely to have gone missing somewhere between the end of 1993 and the first 6 months of 1994. So we're calling on the public to think back to that time. Take a while to think where you were and who you knew at this time. Do you think you might know the man we are seeking to identify?" She added, "Our research shows that activating memories from a particular period can help individuals remember more information from that particular time. So we're asking you to read through a list of news and events that happened in 1993/1994. It's kind of a side note, but I thought that last bit was was very interesting. Anyway, all of this got me thinking, and segue alert, I formed the first theory I wanted to discuss today. This is purely just my own speculation, of course, but all of this has led me to naturally wonder whether the gentleman could have died long before he entered the water. One thing that is established is that foul play was involved. We know that from his injuries and the fact his body was weighed down. So who's to say that this foul play didn't take place months before his body was put into the sea? Perhaps he could have been mixed up in some kind of illegal activity, or got on the wrong side of the kinds of people who might kill you for it. Then after his murder, maybe the gentleman's body was stored somewhere cold enough to preserve it, which is why his remains were still intact enough so that his shoes remained on his feet, for example. Of course, we just don't know the truth. So in that case, we have to assume that anything is possible, don't we? Following on from this idea, I wanted to explore a theory that relates to the way the gentleman's body entered the water in the first place. Throughout my research, I think I'd taken it for granted that he was probably placed or thrown into the sea from a shoreline on the coast of a certain country, be it England, France, Germany, or elsewhere. I had a vision of some faceless person or people, perhaps in a small boat just offshore, attaching the cast iron cobbler's shoes to his body and lowering it off the side into the water whilst the tide was going out, hoping that the current would carry him off deeper into the sea. But the authorities in Germany have suggested that it's possible that he could have been thrown into the ocean from a much larger vessel, a ship way further out in the middle of the sea rather than off a coast. This theory is extra intriguing, as this would then raise the question of why he was on a large ship. How many people knew he was there and could have been complicit? Why was he dressed so smartly whilst out at sea? Whether he had been killed before the ship set sail or whether the murder had taken place on board. What kind of ship it had been. Was it a working boat or something like a cruise ship? If his corpse had been taken onto the ship, how did that happen? And if he'd boarded the vessel alive, why did no one notice he hadn't disembarked? Or did the whole crew know about the crime? I feel like I could continue on with this list for hours, probably because with every single new theory or scenario that pops up, 100 questions then stem from it. This case is genuinely one of the most puzzling I think I've come across to date. And here we reached the point where I've covered pretty much every piece of information available about this story as of me recording this. We certainly know a lot more than we did a few years ago, thanks to the updates that have been released from both the German authorities and the Australian researchers. But aside from that, what's left are the mountains of speculative posts that continue to be left on internet forums and comment sections on a regular basis. I've spent hours reading the thoughts of armchair detectives from around the globe over the past couple of weeks. And whilst this isn't something I do very often on the podcast, because I try not to get too wrapped up in speculation, in a case like this one, I think it's worth giving a moment's thought to any possibility really. When decades have gone by with so few answers, you never know which thread could end up being the one that unravels to reveal something important. So it can be worth gently pulling on a few of them. Possibly unsurprisingly, one of the most common suggestions is that the gentleman could have been a spy, or involved in some kind of secret business where his identity was always destined to be difficult to ascertain, in life or in death. I think this is a credible idea, and elements of this story made me think back to the case of the Isdal woman that I previously covered in 2 parts here on the show. It would definitely help to explain why no one has come forward to identify the man from his police sketch, distinctive build or clothing, but due to the very nature of this theory, if it is correct, it's likely we'll never know the truth one way or another. Another very popular theory that's mentioned in almost every discussion board I read online is that the gentleman could actually be one of the most famous missing people of all time, Lord Lucan. Now, if you don't know the tale of Lord Lucan, it's a complex and fascinating one to look into, but in a nutshell, he was a British aristocrat who went missing back in 1974 under a cloud of suspicion that he had murdered his children's nanny and attempted to kill his wife. Obviously, there's a big time discrepancy here. We're talking 20 years, and most of the people who try to connect the cases seem to rely on the gentleman's smart clothing and the fact that he and Lord Lucan were both tall. I'm definitely not convinced by this one. I think if there was any credible evidence to suggest that he could have been Lord Lucan, that testing could have quite easily been done at some point to prove it. But, stranger things have happened, so who am I to say for sure? One other point that people sometimes make when discussing the case is that isotope analysis, the testing that determined the gentleman likely spent a lot of his life in Australia, isn't always considered to be 100% accurate. From what I understand, I think there might be something to this argument, as it seems there have been a few cases where the isotope testing has proven to have not worked perfectly. But as I always like to make clear, I am not a scientist, so I really can't say one way or another, but at the very least it's something to bear in mind. And then, of course, there are numerous other names that have been put forward in different comment sections, from people determined to try and work out the gentleman's identity. These are usually the names of missing people who are perhaps lesser known, but match a certain characteristic of the gentleman, be that his height, or a connection to a certain country or area, or just the time frame in which he went missing. But as of yet, none of these ideas have led to anything concrete. So what do I think? I feel like the only theory I'm really certain about is that if there was a gap of months between the gentleman going missing and being found in the North Sea, that he surely could not have been in the water that whole time. So he must have been either murdered early on and his body stored somewhere, or he was kept alive and captive for a time before he was killed and his body placed in the sea. But then that wouldn't make sense, because surely they were only able to conclude that there was this time gap because of how long he'd been deceased, right? But then again, this possible time gap is quite broad. This case is just so bizarre. I think the ship theory is credible, despite how many new questions it raises. And I find the idea that he could have been involved in some kind of secretive line of work plausible too. I feel that could help to explain the lack of answers in this case. Despite the publicity it's received, especially more recently, I will be keeping a very close eye out for any updates in this story, and no matter what happened, I just hope that his true identity is one day uncovered. John Doe, Jane Doe, Angel, Gentleman. These monikers can be useful in cold cases, but ultimately they're no substitute for any person's real name. I can already tell that I will have set a fair few of you off down the rabbit hole on this one. I know that since I started looking into this case, I have found myself visiting all kinds of forum pages and discussion boards, just looking for any scraps of information that could help to build a fuller picture of this story. It's so frustrating and so intriguing, and I would genuinely love to hear what you make of it. What do you think could have happened to the gentleman? Where do you think he was from? And what do you think happened to him in the gap of time between when he went missing or was killed and his body being found? There are lots of ways you can get in touch and share your thoughts, and I'll be telling you about all of them very soon. But before we get to that point, we must first take a trip over to our outro feature. So without further ado, here is Weird Media. I think it's safe to say that based on my past weird media recommendations, I really am a huge fan of the one and only Bob Mortimer. The remake of Randall and Hopkirk that he starred in was our very first weird media pick, and I mentioned him just a couple of episodes ago when I recommended the brilliant Last One Laughing UK. So I thought, why not make it a hat trick and give a shout out to one of my absolute favourite autobiographies of all time, which is of course Bob Mortimer's, and it's called And Away ... I first read it when I was on holiday a few years ago, and I could not put it down. I think I finished it within a couple of days. Bob is such a fascinating person to me for many reasons, but I think some of it boils down to the fact that he has such a wonderfully bizarre and whimsical sense of humour, yet on paper and at first glance, you'd think he was the most quote-unquote normal person in the world. I love him because, to me, he's the definition of the good kind of weird, and the fact that his career began with him working as a solicitor and evolved into him being one of the most beloved comedians in the UK is just brilliant. But there is so much more to Bob Mortimer, and his autobiography delves into everything from traumatic events he experienced in his childhood, like the loss of his dad at a young age, to his amazing relationships, including his partnerships with Vic Reeves and Paul Whitehouse, and just how unique his journey to fame was. Even though I was somewhat devastated to discover that he didn't really enjoy making Randall and Hopkirk, which I think was possibly down to a bit of imposter syndrome, I loved the book overall. And if I'm ever lucky enough to meet Bob, I hope I get to tell him that I, for one, think he did an amazing job playing Jeff Randall. Not that my opinion as a stranger should mean anything much to him, but I would love to tell him all the same. Anyway, all of this is to say that if you're looking for a new autobiography to read, even if you're not hugely familiar with Bob Mortimer's work, I think it's an incredibly interesting look into both his life and the UK comedy and television world, especially as it was a few years back. And I'm sure it goes without saying that it's a very entertaining read indeed. Okay, we have a slightly shorter source shout-out section today, as there are really only a few proper articles that have been written about this case. Two of those that have are from the Guardian newspaper, one from April 2022 by Philip Alterman, and the other was from August of 2022, and that one was in collaboration with the Australian Associated Press. We had a great piece from the Independent newspaper, that was by Chiara Giordano, also from August of 2022. There was a piece from the Australian ABC News website. That was by Erin Park, published in July of 2024. We had a piece from The Mirror by Tom Pettifor from April 2022, and another from the Metro newspaper by Jordan King. That one was from February 2022. As promised, here's a quick rundown of all of the ways you can get in touch. On Instagram and also Threads, just look up at Things Get Weird Podcast. On TikTok, we are at Things Are About to Get Weird. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching for the podcast name. Over there, you'll find our main page as well as our private discussion group. If you prefer email, our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. And as I always say, if you've enjoyed this episode, a super quick rating or review wherever you're listening would be hugely appreciated. On Spotify, you can do a star rating. And on places like Apple Podcasts, you can leave a written review if you have a spare moment. I'm super grateful for every single rating and review. They really do help the podcast. A massive thank you to all of you for joining me today and for your continued support. And I look forward to bringing you another strange but true story very soon. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.